CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Kenya's 2017 election has brought with it a strong sense of déjà vu. While incumbent President Uhuru Kenyatta has been declared the winner of an election observers unanimously declared as free, fair and credible, opposition leader Raila Odinga and his NASA coalition have disputed the outcome of the election and are now headed to the courts, which have 14 days to hear and determine the case. So just how free and fair were the elections? And what are the challenges for both reconciliation and economic development in Kenya's election aftermath? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, in what has been dubbed as Kenya's most hotly contested election, President Uhuru Kenyatta was declared winner this past Friday by the country's Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, beating former Prime Minister Raila Odinga by a 10% margin. The election marked record voter turnout with up to 15.2 million of the 19.6 million registered voters casting their ballot. Now, Kenya's election process has largely been hailed as fair and successful by multiple observer missions, including those of the East African Community, the Commonwealth, the USA's Carter Center, and the African Union. However, Mr. Odinga has come out to strongly criticize the results in some observer missions and is quoted as saying that they have basically given approval to a fairly flawed process by grossly violating their mandate and calling upon his party to concede. And as congratulatory messages from regional and international heads of state continue to pour in for Kenyatta's newly elected government, Odinga is now taking the battle to Kenya's Supreme Court, saying that they will not just accept and move on.
IEBC might have declared Uhuru Kenyatta president, but a vast number of Kenyans have not accepted the legitimacy of the decision and will not accept it. And will not accept it until they have answers to profoundly disturbing questions that have been raised.
And now to offer further analysis into the aftermath of Kenya's election, I'm joined in studio by expert guest Dr. Alex Awiti, Director of the East African Institute at the Aga Khan University, and Daisy Amdani, Executive Director at the Community Advocacy and Awareness Trust. Thank you both for joining us on the program. Alex, I'll start off with you now. 8 observer missions have given Kenya the go-ahead that the election was free, fair, and credible, but this is not a sentiment shared by Kenya's opposition party. What is it that Kenyans will need to see if indeed the opposition does have irregularities? Well,
you know, the observer missions have a very different audit mission, which is an audit of process, is an audit of the laws, it's an audit of the electoral process as put by IEBC. And in some cases they come a few months or weeks before the polling day, just to look at the campaign process, monitor the language that is used, get a sense of the campaign financing, and all of the other kind of fairness, coverage, media coverage, security, and all these other potential complaints that could be in there. And then on the polling day, it just did the ballots show up in time. It's a very cosmetic kind of buddy observer kind of a thing. We just want to see whether you meet basic standards, but it does not. In many ways, there are many elections that have been hotly contested, even after observers have given those a clean bill of health. And there are many elections that have been unfairly contested as well, even after the observers have given a clean bill of health. And that's 2013, for instance. The observers said the election was fair, Raila went to court, the thing was thrown away. So it's really, you can't just use the observers' kind of decision at the end in terms of an assessment of the election to basically score the election as fair or not fair.
Daisy, your thoughts?
I want to agree with Alex on that score because, first of all, I think it's wrong for us to premise the success or lack of the success of our elections on observer mission statements because their work is very superficial. You've seen the checklists. It is also irresponsible of us as a nation and as a people not to have a basic standard for ourselves and want our systems to be validated by outsiders who don't go in depth, because the elections are not an event, it's a process. And it's a lengthy process. We are looking at civic education, we look at the laws, you know, the regulation of campaign finances, political parties, how do they behave? Now, if you're looking at the elections per se, in terms of the 8th of August,
right,
the elections themselves, there was nothing wrong with the elections. And usually there's nothing wrong with the elections because Kenyans vote peacefully. They're allowed to vote, polling. I mean, in terms of looking at irregularities, there are very few irregularities these days with regard to the actual election day.
So what is it exactly that the opposition, Kenya's opposition, is complaining about?
Well, you know, one of the things that we've got to accept, when you enter into an electoral process, you must be ready to lose. And that's the problem that we have in Kenya, is that we don't have a culture of losing. Nobody loses. And of course, when you lose, you would want to find reason, especially when you believe that you've put everything in place
right,
to give yourself that advantage and you're almost certain of a win, and then you don't get a win. Of course, then you must interrogate the process. And the laws provide for avenues for that. So they are reacting to the fact that they were so sure it was a done deal, and then it wasn't.
Alex, though, this suspicion between, you know, the electoral parties and the various parties, and this suspicion goes back to 2007, when of course, Johan Kriegler, the judge investigating it, and of course, Samuel Kivitu, the chairman of the Electoral Commission, both said they couldn't really tell the outcome of that election. That is where this suspicion is. Do you think Kenya has put enough in place electoral reforms to ensure that that doesn't happen again?
But Beatrice, it goes beyond that. 1992, contested by Raila Odinga, the father to Raila, Kenneth Matiba, Mwai Kibaki. They disputed the outcomes of that election. In 1997, the same thing. And there was a dispute. So 2007 was not a surprise coming on the back of 1997. 2013 was not a surprise coming on the back of 2007. But it is really interesting that even with that verdict of Kriegler, even that decision that Kriegler made, and everybody else, you know, many other people came here, Condoleezza Rice and the rest said nobody could tell who won that election, including the chairman himself. So I think there is something in us about not trusting our systems, but there's also something about the Kenyan character and the fact that we always believe that somebody's going to fiddle with something. So it doesn't matter how much technology you throw at this. This is by far the most expensive election in terms of the gear and the equipment and all of the preparedness, but it still hasn't worked. We even reduced the number of people that would be on a queue. We've capped the number of polling stations in terms of individuals to 700 just to make the counting easy. Right. But we still have ended up with one of the most disputed and discredited elections in our history, especially going by the pronouncements of Mr. Raila Odinga.
Right, the electoral reforms that we've put in place, those are not enough to ensure that the election is free, fair and credible?
First of all, I want, you know, the incidences that Alex has spoken of, where the opposition have always disputed the electoral outcomes, part of the problem have been state excesses and misuse of state office, where they get an unfair advantage, okay? And so this is the same thing that we are witnessing today. Now, systems are only as good as the people who manage them. You know, we can buy the most expensive machines, but we must address the issue of our software as Kenyans. That if people are willing to be compromised to then compromise the electoral system, because you know the days of ballot stuffing and whatever, all those things are gone. So you just build systemic weaknesses in the system, unfair practice. And when we look at the elections, because I think it's also unfair, well, I don't know if the right word to use is unfair, but it's also, it's dishonest for people to cry foul when in actual fact, when we look at our processes, they're pretty shambolic. If you recall, the nomination exercise, and this was across the board, right, whether it was the ruling administration, Jubilee Party, or whether it was the opposition parties, all the nomination processes were shambolic. Now, the fact that we are willing to engage in processes that are shambolic, but we are happy as long as it delivers to us a victory. And then when we now enter into an arena where we don't have full control,
Right.
and it doesn't deliver to us what we expect, then we cry foul. That is dishonest, and we must address that, because if we're looking at a system of a free, fair, and credible election, then the entire process must be a credible process. Because if today we invalidate the presidential vote, the presidential election, we say that the presidential election did not meet the threshold for free and fair, then it also goes to the credibility of all other elections, because they all happen on the same day at the same time. But if you were to call the presidential vote into question, calls to question all the other votes.
Alex.
But I think, so this is what is interesting in this process, as Desi has said. If you blow out the presidential election, the tallying process, you call to question just every aspect of the 2017 election. There are places where there's been quibbling by governor candidates, like in Meru, for instance, in Kajiado, there are contestations, in Machakos. Those outcomes have not been accepted by the losers. And these are also areas where the numbers also look pretty interesting. You know, the so-called 54s in this election. A very interesting number, because that kind of compares very well with the numbers that Kenyatta himself polled.
Right.
So I think whatever verdict comes out of this presidential election petition would have severe consequences on the entire electoral process. And I think what it would call for is a very rigorous, thorough, far-reaching audit of the entire IEBC establishment.
Right. Let's look beyond this now, because the last 1 week has been a very tense time for Kenya, though, and now that NASA coalition and Mr. Odinga have decided to go to court versus the street protests. What is the response, though? What response are we getting here from Kenyans in Mr. Odinga's assertion of going to court, or decision to go to court, as opposed to taking the street protest?
Well, it is interesting because, you know, Desi and I were speaking at some other forum, and we basically said that Mr. Odinga has to go to court. That is the only reasonable, institutionally acceptable way to contest the presidential election. Every other way will be illegal and will be catastrophic. Now that he's gone to court, his supporters are very happy. So it is just really interesting about how much psychophancy there is around politicians, that even their own supporters would not call them out when they're just about to violate the law. So the country is relieved. Everybody is extremely happy that Raila has taken that course of action. The embassies have been calling, and they're saying they're very pleased. The religious organizations are extremely happy. And so I think what Mr. Odinga has done merits absolute applaud.
Right. Daisy?
I agree. There's a great sense of relief, because the minute you decide to do what they call the mass action, you actually have no control. You lose control. People can plant, you know, people in there,
Right.
and it will degenerate into a bad situation. And that's what people were afraid of, that if they call for mass action, it will degenerate into a very violent, you know, confrontation. So we are glad that even in seeking redress, Right Honorable Raila Odinga has chosen to use the legally laid down channels. And so we wish for the best outcome for Kenya, because this is not just about Raila. This is not about NASA. This is about Kenya.
But these two parties and these two leaders, of course, they're meeting for the second or third time now on the ballot box. These two leaders have different ideological beliefs. They come from two separate divides. Mr. Kenyatta is seen very much as a capitalist, and Raila Odinga is seen more as a social democrat. How do you then reconcile post-election? How do you reconcile the two sides and the supporters of the two sides, whoever has lost or whoever has won? How do you reconcile their supporters?
Well, you know, because you're exactly right. If you read the two manifestos that are presented by these two parties, it's exactly that. One is big projects and big government, which is really interesting. Raila Odinga is big government but redistribution, in a way that you're kind of trying to make sure that social goods and services actually reach the very ordinary people. And you're laying a foundation for social democracy. You're laying a foundation for upholding the constitution, for strengthening devolution. On the other hand, Mr. Kenyatta is about business as usual. Let's go on with the big infrastructure projects. These things, to me, are not necessarily polar opposites, but they're just different visions of running a country. Now, they didn't see light of day, both of those manifestos, because A, Mr. Kenyatta didn't show up for the debate, and B, those things were also released too late. The manifestos came too late, and there was no engagement. So I think this is the missed opportunity, that if we found time during the election process to lay out these two competing visions, maybe the elections would have been less ethnically polarized. Because then the people who are on the lower end of the economy would realize that there will be some aid and some relief with respect to housing. And there will be some fair amount of social protection, that education can be made real and equitable for all. While Mr. Kenyatta would still make the argument, like, we need to do the plumbing, rig the big infrastructure, then the citizen, but I might also rack up more debt. So people will then have an absolutely clear basis for evaluating both of those propositions on their merit. But we miss that. But I think, in my view, it is the inexcusable laziness on the part of the political class, their inability to engage citizens, as if we also have brains in our heads and that we can think and engage with them at that level, rather than just appealing to our ethnic passions and polarizing the country along ethnic lines.
Daisy.
For me, I would like to say that nothing stops Jubilee from adopting the vision that has been captured in the NASA manifesto in terms of being able to address the challenges that are faced by the masses. Because for as long as we have the inequality gap, cohesion is going to remain a problem. And while we may talk about engaging with issues, it's very difficult to engage with real issues when you're living from hand to mouth. So that inequality gap, and it has been growing over the years because of the way we have designed our development, the way we have designed our politics around development. So we need government and whichever administration is in place to seriously address the challenges that are being faced by the ordinary mwananchi, so that they begin to appeal to that and bring the ordinary mwananchi to a level that they can engage with issues. Now, nothing stops Jubilee from adopting that. So from finding that balance. And that's what mainly people are reacting to, because when you look at the NASA bloc, the majority of their supporters, they're from the low end of society. Those people who are living hand to mouth, and they feel there's a sense of mourning among them, because it's like they feel that they have been denied the opportunity to rise up from that situation. Now, one of the things that President Kenyatta committed to when he accepted, when he was announced the winner, he said that he is committed to leaving Kenya better than he found it. And one of the things about addressing that is the cohesiveness. And that cohesiveness is not going to be addressed by looking at tribal, ethnic arrangements in job creation. It's about creating an enabling environment where everybody, regardless of your tribe, that you're able to rise. So we must look at public service delivery. We must look at education. We must look at health, that it is accessible to all, not because you belong to a certain class, but because you are a citizen in this country.
And looking at the competitiveness of this election, though, how likely do you see Mr. Kenyatta delivering on those promises?
I actually want to believe and take him at his word, because until he proves himself otherwise, we cannot say. He has said he wants to leave Kenya better than he found it. There are so many ideas that are out there, and among them are some of the ideas that were captured within the NASA manifesto. Nothing stops him from adopting that, because as the head of state, he is not the president of Jubilee. He is the president of Kenya, and he is a symbol of national unity. And therefore, he must reach out to all Kenyans, even those who did not vote for him, with that assurance that he cares about their well-being, about their livelihoods, and that he will do everything within his power to ensure that he improves their lives.
All right, Daisy Amdani and Dr. Alex Awiti, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much for your contribution to the program. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll have more insights into Kenya's election aftermath. Do stay with us.
Accra is my kind of city. That's because when I'm here, I feel like I'm back home in Lagos or Abidjan, which are two of the major cities I grew up in.
Business in Africa is high risk.
After about a decade covering business news on the continent, I've learned it's all about the high risk, but also the high returns and the high energy. You simply have to adjust in order to keep pace. When I started out as a journalist, my dream was to open people's minds to the different perspectives. From the CEO in the boardroom to the trader out in the street, we all have different stories. From Accra to Addis Ababa, from Cairo to Cape Town, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Here at CGTN, we realize that Africa is on the move, and it's moving fast, but we're moving right along with it. I'm Uche Okoronkwo, and I'm a business anchor and reporter at CGTN.
But elections are also expensive affairs. So what has been the cost to Kenya's economy at the domestic and regional level of the uncertainty that gripped the country ahead of and following the election? CGTN spoke to Julian Amboko, research analyst at Stratlink Africa, to find out.
Julius, there was a lot of anxiety in the run-up during the elections and even after the elections. Could you give us a sense how the economy was affected by the just concluded Kenyan elections?
Okay, as you'd imagine, just a week later, it's a bit too early to tell, but we do know from history that every election year tends to have slowdown, especially in terms of economic growth, because the anxiety around the business activity and what implications an election would have. This year, fortunately, the incidences of violence and protests were in isolated areas, and we didn't see it spill over into the central business district of the capital city, which was quite, it afforded the business community a sigh of relief. So we are still waiting for the whole scenario to crystallize. So we begin now putting numbers where they actually belong as to the impact that could have been suffered in this regard.
Because the slowdown can be directly attributed to people staying away for a whole week from work. Obviously, there are some losses that can be quantified, like the Matatu sector, saying they've lost around 700 million shillings. Do we know what kind of losses other sectors might have suffered?
Not quite, because if you look at sectors like manufacturing, if you look at retail, what would happen is that there would be a lag effect even after the election. If you speak to a couple of retailers right now, they're telling you the traffic is yet to pick up to what it actually was before the election. So what we're hoping for is a scenario whereby once this we conclude this month and going into September, and we have the Supreme Court ruling and we see how that goes, then we'll be able now to begin to get a clearer picture that is gives us an indication of the kind of hit we could have taken as an economy from the electoral cycle.
So maybe let's talk about that Supreme Court challenge. How do you see investors reacting to Mr. Odinga's decision to take the outcome of the election to court?
I think it was a welcome move. The entire business community was viewed the decision as the right move to take, because there were really no alternatives apart from mass action. So the belief in institutions and the confidence that we could actually resolve this matter in the laid out constitutional procedure was a welcome move for the business community. What we hope for is that whichever way the ruling goes, that the sense of calm, the sense of continuity in the business community will be seen to prevail, and hoping that we don't have scenarios where whichever side is ruled to have won, we have episodes of uncertainty again coming into play.
Earlier this week, we saw Mr. Odinga's call for a mass stay away largely ignored. Why do you think the business community took that route?
Well, people have realities, economic realities, in the sense that even if a political situation is prevailing, you still have bills to pay at the end of the day. You still have a contractual agreement with your employer. And therefore, it was widely anticipated that the call notwithstanding, people would want to resume work. And there was actually a massive push for people to resume work, because businesses were beginning to take a hit in terms of volumes being driven. So it was expected that there would begin to be a resurgence of people getting back to work, and we were not surprised by the time of events.
Also, Kenyans really suffered from high cost of living in the run-up to this election, with commodities like unga, milk, sometimes sugar, unavailable at grocery stores. What is the situation like on the ground now?
A spot check we conducted about a week ago indicated that, for particularly maize flour, was back in in supply in a number of the retail chains. We have seen inflation now going back towards the central bank target band. And therefore, we are confident that in the event that the short rains we should be coming do not fail us, the situation will continue to improve because the food index was the key factor driving inflation in the run-up to the election. But depending on how the Supreme Court ruling goes and how the impact it has, we could wait to see how food supplies will actually be affected, because as you rightly pointed out, the moment people stay away from their businesses, then supply becomes a challenge. So we are keen to observe how that unfolds.
So the Supreme Court will have a direct impact on Kenya's current economic woes as well?
I think both direct and indirect, yeah. Yeah, because the immediate perception of how the whole country reacts to the ruling made will be a matter of interest, and also just the lag effect. Now, what happens as a ripple effect 2 months down the line is what now I was referring to as an indirect.
One can say when Kenya sneezes, the whole region catches a cold, and it's been a feature for economies that surround the country since 2007. That whatever happens here obviously affects them as well. How can Kenya cushion its economy and that of the East African region from election-related instability?
I think that's a matter of strengthening institutions. Yeah, it's all about strengthening institutions. The moment the Electoral Commission is perceived to have a credible process, and then thereafter, even if there are matters of dispute, we see a scenario where the political actors are actually willing to take it to the Supreme Court, yeah, or whichever other courts, depending on the level of dispute. That alone gives that sense that this is a maturing democracy, whereby the political actors not only have confidence in the process, but actually believe justice will be delivered at the end of the day. So I think the more we do that, and we have seen a lot of effort going towards this end, right from the passing of the 2010 Constitution. In the run-up to this election, there was a lot of crossing of T's and dotting of I's on matters pertaining to the electoral law. So that in itself is what we believe will be the biggest and safest bet as far as cushioning this economy from volatility related to electoral cycles is concerned.
Do you also think the business community is looking forward to a time that Kenya can run an election that doesn't take a week off work, but in fact just takes a day, for example, as you see in other economies?
Absolutely. I think that is the target that everyone would be aspiring to. But we must appreciate that this is a process. And given the historical background that we have actually come a long way as far as the electoral process management is concerned. So we are quite optimistic that based on the reforms we have seen in the last 5 years, actually the last decade, that we are making progress as far as strengthening these institutions go, and we are likely to see the same continue because the Kenyan voter has become excessively vigilant of the entire procedure, questioning every point where there is uncertainty, which is a good thing, and we are optimistic that this will continue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your time.